Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are continuing our Unit 4 drive towards the end of the semester. And we are switching gears now. We've talked a bit about nationalism, and now we're going to talk about imperialism and its spread across the world. And we're first going to take a look at imperialism in Southeast Asia. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. It is a 2 title note day. We are starting a new chapter, finally getting out of 4, 5, and 6. Now we're in chapter 7, the reach of imperialism. So make sure you put that at the top upper part of your margins, chapter 7. And colonial rule in Southeast Asia, colonies, imperialism, imperialization, colonization, they are synonymous. Okay. America started off as what? Colonies. Okay. So, chapter 7, lesson 1. That was your warm up. So objectives, we're going to identify the causes for imperialism. We're going to compare and contrast direct and indirect rule in Southeast Asia. And then we're going to sequence information to learn about the effects of imperialism. All right, so new imperialism. Not that anything was new, but it just took a different flavor. It looked a little bit different. So in the 19th century, a new phase of Western expansion began. European nations began to view Asian and African societies as a source of industrial raw materials and a market for Western manufactured goods, meaning they saw an opening, they could use their resources to manufacture and make stuff and then sell it to them back for what they took back and made to their own manufactured items, and they sell it back for double the price. Win, win, win. In the 1880s, European states began an intense scramble for overseas territory. Remember, more land equals more what? Power. All right, so imperialism is the extension of a nation's power over other lands, and it was not new, like I said. However, the imperialism in the late 19th century is called new imperialism by some historians was different. Earlier, European states had to be content, especially in the case of Africa and Asia, to set up a few trading posts where they could carry on trade and perhaps some missionary activity. Now they sought nothing less than direct control over vast territories. Why did Westerners begin to increase their search for colonies after 1880? There was a strong economic motive. Capitalist states in the West were looking for both markets and raw materials such as tea, coffee, rubber, oil, and tin. These resources were quickly becoming essential for the creation of many commodities European industries produced. But this issue was simply not an economic one. European nation states were involved in heated rivalries. They acquired colonies abroad in order to gain strategic and economic advantage over their rivals. And colonies were also a source of national prestige. And to some people, a nation could not be great if they didn't have colonies. I mean, Mr. Ovalle knows what he's talking about. Come on, more land equals more power. This was your map for the most part. Similarly, from your warm-up, Southeast Asia. All right, white man's burden. Gotta know this phrase. In addition, imperialism was tied to social Darwinism and racism. Social Darwinists, if you don't recall, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He did not coin the term survival of the fittest, but it is usually associated with Darwin's theory of evolution. But social Darwinists apply that motto to society, believing the struggle between nations, the fit are more victorious than others. And of course, racism, everyone knows racism. It's the belief that race determines traits and capabilities that are, and that particular races are superior or inferior. Not a good train of thought, but that is how people thought 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Imperial ambitions and conquest strengthened European nationalism, led to some colonizers to view colonized people as inferior others. Some Europeans took a more religious and humanitarian approach to imperialism. they believed Europeans had a moral responsibility to civilize those who they consider primitive people, and that's what they called this responsibility, the white man's burden. Okay, to some, that meant that the Christian message, bringing the Christian message to the heathen masses. To others, it meant that bringing the benefits of Western democracy and capitalism to those societies. But it is the burden on the white European to bring this civilization to the places they took over. Okay, white man's burden, got to know it. So here you have Britain carrying their empire of peoples, and you got America, who's got these new peoples, and they're climbing barbarism, oppression, superstition, ignorance, vice, brutality, slavery, cannibalism, vice, cruelty, ignorance. I mean, all the way up to the top of civilization. And this is Britain. This is Uncle Sam. And they're trying to show the path towards civilization. Of course, Britain is up there first. All right, new technology. So 19th century technological developments were also important to the development and growth of imperialism. New military weapons such as the machine gun gave Europeans a superior military force, enabling them in pitched battles to defeat those who resisted a takeover of their lands. Military superiority also gave European nations a huge advantage in diplomacy in these new territories. European nations could often get what they wanted from Asian and African societies with only the presence of a powerful advanced navy, a process known as gunboat diplomacy. New forms of transportation, a direct result of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, helped advance imperialism as well. Technological developments in railroad and steam power allowed Europeans to travel faster and more easily. These advances also helped Europeans remove resources from colonies more easily and allowed European missionaries to travel to more remote locations. Also, new forms of communication also advanced imperialism. The telegraph, for example, allowed colonial regimes to communicate with Europe faster than ever before, with giving European nations a high degree of control over their colonies. Advances in print technology also helped Christian missionaries spread their religion, and better organize new colonial churches. Medical advancements also helped serve to further imperialist adventures. Long journeys and tropical climates took a heavy toll on European conquerors. New medicines, such as the use of quinine to combat malaria, made it possible for Europeans to live in difficult climates, and larger numbers of Europeans could now survive in Africa and Asia. I'm going to change that real quick. I know I normally never do this, but I just had a thought in my head that said, Mr. Ovalle, that should be highlighted in red. So bear with me. Okay, what size is this? 21.5. Sorry, it's got to look uniform, you know what I'm saying? All right, let's change that to red. Because I mean, without quinine, not to say that it's a cure, but it allowed Europeans to stay in Africa and Asia longer. So quinine, very important. Here's the rapid machine gun. There's a new boat. Here's more land. All right, Southeast Asia vibes. All right, the new imperialism was evident in Southeast Asia. This region had long been known for its consumable resources such as sugar, tea, and various spices. In 1800, the Europeans only had two established colonies in this region, the Spanish Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. In 1900, virtually the entire area was under Western rule. The process of colonial expansion began with Great Britain. 1819, Great Britain GB sent Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles to found a new colony on a small island on the tip of the Malay Peninsula. It was a strategic location overlooking the high traffic shipping lane, and it was called Singapore, or City of the Lion. Lions are usually associated with Britain. That's their soccer team nickname. They're called the Three Lions. Anyways, I digress. In this new age of steamships, it soon became a major stopping point for traffic traveling to or from China. During the next few decades, the British advanced in the Southeast Asia continued. Next to fall was the Kingdom of Burma, aka modern-day Myanmar, because the British wanted to control it in order to protect its possessions in India. They said, hey, let's take over this nearby land so we can have more access to India. Makes sense. They also sought to a land route through Burma into southern China, although the difficult land terrain along this frontier between Burma and China caused the effort to fail, aka the Himalayas. British activities in Burma led to the fall of the Burmese monarchy, and Britain soon established control over the entire country. So we're talking about right here. This is Burma, Myanmar. France's turn. So when France sent missionaries operating in Vietnam, they nervously watched the British advance into Burma. These local Vietnamese authorities who viewed Christianity as a threat to Confucian doctrine persecuted the French missionaries. However, Vietnam failed to stop the Christian missionaries, and soon the Vietnamese internal rivalries divided the country into two separate governments, the North and the South. France was especially alarmed by the British attempts to monopolize trade. So to stop British movement into Vietnam, the French government decided in 1857 to force the Vietnamese to accept French protection. You can't succeed as a country unless you have our protection, aka we're going to take over your country and run it for you. The French eventually succeeded in making the Vietnamese ruler give up his territories in the Mekong River Delta. The French occupied the city of Saigon and for 30 years extended the control over the rest of the country. In 1883, the French seized the city of Hanoi and made the Vietnamese Empire a French protectorate. In the 1880s, France extended its control over neighboring Cambodia, Annam, Tonkin, and Laos. And by 1887, France included all its new possessions into what was called the Union of French Indochina. So this is Saigon. This is where they were at first. Oh, hold on. Sorry. I'm busy. I gotta make this lecture, y'all. Go back to this. This is Annam. This is where they were at. Okay. And then they add Cambodia. They add Cochin, this yellow part. Then Annam is like the majority of Vietnam. Tonkin's the top part, and that's where Hanoi is. And then Laos. All right, Thailand's the exception. After the French conquest of Indochina, Thailand, then called Siam, was also the only remaining free state in Southeast Asia. But the rivalry between the British and the French threatened to police Thailand under its colonial rule too. Two remarkable rulers to prevent this from happening. One was King Mongkut, who was in a movie as the king of The King and I, and the other was the son King Chulalongkorn. Both promoted Western learning and maintained friendly relations with the European major powers. In 1896, Britain and France agreed to maintain Thailand as an independent buffer state between their possessions in Southeast Asia because this is Siam, this is where they are, and it's between Burma and Indochina. So this is all Thailand going all the way down. These are the two, Mongkut on the left and Chulalongkorn on the right, father, son. America's expansion. So in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, which we already talked about, the U.S. naval forces under Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in the Philippines. Believing it was his moral obligation to civilize other parts of the world, President William McKinley decided to turn the Philippines, which had been under Spanish control, into an American colony. This would also prevent the area from falling into the hands of the Japanese, and the islands would give the U.S. a convenient access to trade with China. Many Filipinos did not wish to be under American control, however. You have one guy, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the leader of a movement for independence in the Philippines. He began his revolt against the Spanish and would soon went into exile in 1898. When the U.S. acquired the Philippines, Aguinaldo continued his revolt and set himself up as the president of the Republic of the Philippines. Led by Aguinaldo, the guerrilla forces fought bitterly against the U.S. troops and their independence. Many in the U.S. government were unwilling to give up advantages gained by the possessions of the Philippines. So the fight for Filipino independence resulted in 3 years of bloody warfare, and in the end, the U.S. defeated the Filipino forces, and President McKinley had a stepping stone to the rich markets in China. That's Emilio Aguinaldo. There's the battle. They left from Hong Kong and fought in Manila. All right, rule and discrimination. So, Western powers governed their new colonial empires either directly or indirectly, and their chief goals were to exploit natural resources of the lands and to open up markets for their own manufactured goods. Sometimes a colonial power could realize its goal by cooperating with local political elites. For example, the Dutch East India Company used indirect rule when they ruled in the Dutch East Indies. Test question. Under indirect rule, local rulers were allowed to keep their authority and status in a new colonial setting. This made access to the region's natural resources easier, and it was cheaper because fewer officials had to be trained, and it affected local culture less. However, indirect rule is not always possible. Some local elites resisted foreign conquest, and in these cases, local elites were replaced with Western officials, and this system was called direct rule. Great Britain, for example, administered Burma directly through its colonial government in India. In Indochina, the French used both systems with direct rule in South Vietnam and indirectly through their emperor in northern Vietnam. To justify conquest, Western powers spoke about bringing blessings of Western civilization to their colonial subjects. They imposed their cultural norms to these colonies, such as the European marriage practices and Western styles of dress. They also attempted to alter the role of women in colonial societies to more closely match those roles of European women. And while they also promised to bring the practice of representative government to their colonial subjects, many Westerners came to fear the idea of Southeast Asian peoples and the people in their colonies elsewhere being allowed political rights. Wow, talk about a certain elitism, thinking that you have the power to bring democracy to your people, yet you overthrow other people and are upset that they could possibly have political rights in their country already, and then you take it away when you come in with your guns and your disease. I don't know. It's kind of hypocritical, don't you think? Anyways, money is power. Ooh. The colonial powers did not want their colonists to develop their own industries, and colonial policy stressed the export of raw materials. Exports are sent out, imports are brought in. This policy often led to development of plantation agriculture. In this system, peasants worked as wage laborers on the foreign-owned plantations. Plantation owners kept wages at poverty levels to increase profits. Hey, can I give you a call back real quick? Where was I? However, plantation owners kept wages at poverty levels to increase profits. So conditions on plantations were so unhealthy that thousands died. Peasants also bore the burden of high taxes. Nevertheless, colonial rule did bring some benefits to Southeast Asia, and a modern economic system soon began there. Colonial governments built railroads, highways, and other structures that benefited Southeast Asian peoples as well as colonials living there. The development of an export market helped create an entrepreneurial class in rural areas. In the Dutch East Indies, you had small growers of rubber, palm oil, coffee, tea, spice began sharing the profits of colonial enterprise, but most of the profits were taken back to the colonized country. However, industrialized nations came to have an economic edge over non-industrialized nations. Goods produced in factories could be made faster, cheaper, and much larger quantities than goods made in traditional and largely manual ways in non-industrial nations. Over the course of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the production of goods stagnated or decreased in places such as India, China, and Latin America, but increased in parts of Europe and the United States. Many non-industrialized nations became increasingly dependent on industrialized nations. This resulted in a relationship that some scholars describe an informal empire. In an informal empire, non-industrialized nations, not formally colonized, became increasingly dependent on industrialized nations. These nations would then sometimes threaten violence in order to obtain economic or other agreements that usually benefited them alone. Catch 22. Money, money, money. All right, Invader Zim. So many subject peoples in Southeast Asia resented colonization. It's not like they welcomed them in with open arms, okay? At first, resistance came from the existing ruling class. For example, in Burma, the monarch himself fought Western domination. By contrast, in Vietnam, after the emperor agreed to French control of his country, a number of officials set up an organization called the Con Vuong, or Save the King. I probably butchered that. I'm sorry. They fought against the French without the emperor's help. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, a revolutionary group called the Katipunan, led by Aguinaldo, formed in 1892. They first fought against the Spanish rulers, and when Spain yielded control of the islands to the U.S., the Katipunan fought the Americans as well for independence. Sometimes, though, the resistance to Western control took form in peasant revolts. Peasants often were driven off the land to make way for plantation agriculture. Angry peasants then vented their anger at their foreign invaders. In Burma in 1930, a Buddhist monk named Saya San led a peasant uprising against the British colonial regime. Early resistance movements, however, failed and they were overcome by Western powers. In the early 1900s, a new kind of resistance reemerged that was based on nationalism. Leaders were often from a new class that the colonial rule had created and westernized intellectuals in the cities. They were the first generation to embrace institutions and values of the West. Many were educated in the West and they spoke Western languages, worked in jobs that connected with colonial regimes. And at first, many of these leaders of these movements did not focus clearly on the idea of nationhood, but they just simply tried to defend their economic interests and religious beliefs of the Southeast Asian peoples. So in Burma, students at the University of Rangoon formed an organization to protest against official persecution of the Buddhist religion and the British lack of respect for local religious traditions. This protest against the British arrogance and failure to observe local customs in Buddhist temples. Not until the 1930s did these resistance movements begin to demand national independence. So here you have the Burmese emperor, the Katipunan right here. Or this is the Khan Vuong. This is the Katipunan. This is Sayasan. And that's the protest at the University of Rangoon. And boom, we are done. So yeah, that's going to conclude that lecture. I know I talked really fast, so hopefully you caught up. You know, my phone went off twice. It's okay though. It's okay. So your homework is to do page 257, 2 through 4, obviously, 2 through 4, 2, 3, and 4. Don't skip number 3, please. So page 257, 2 through 4. And yeah, hopefully you guys are keeping up with these notes and staying on top of things because the semester is ending really, really soon. All right. As always, hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Burge.